All right, now broadcasting. That people arrive. Welcome to Powerhouse Arena and our virtual event program. My name is Chris, and I'm very pleased to be hosting the launch for Filthy Beasts by Kirkland Hamill. Thank you everyone for coming. You'll be able to ask questions through the Q&A function on your screen or in the chat. And you can do so throughout the event, and we'll take them at the end. You can also buy the book at powerhousebookstores.com. I'll post it now in the chat. It's 10% off for a limited time. And you can also find the link on the event page too. Kirk will be in conversation with Ray DelBianco, and I'll introduce them now. Ray DelBianco was raised in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, where she wrote and raised livestock from a young age. She attended Duke University and is the author of the novel Rough Animals. Kirkland Hamill has written for Salon and The Advocate, and was formerly the Chief Development and Marketing Officer at the National Center for Family Philanthropy. He lives in Baltimore, Maryland with his husband Dave and a dog named Blue. Hand it over.
Well, congratulations, Kirkland, first of all, on this absolutely incredible debut memoir. I loved the book. I had the privilege of discovering it when I was reviewing book picks for Ralph Lauren. And I read your book right after I read Brideshead Revisited by Evelyn Waugh. And what you brought forward with your memoir felt like a contemporary retelling of that in many ways, but one that went psychologically and emotionally deeper. And it's a book that to me is so about survival, not only of oneself, but of, helping those that you love and also surviving through that. So I was curious, coming from this background of an extraordinary childhood, when was the moment that you knew that you had to write this story?
I remember reading David Sedaris, his book Naked, and I remember just laughing out loud in ways that I had never done with a book before, and it felt familiar, and I just kind of thought to myself, I've got so many stories that I want to write down, and I can do that. I can do what he's doing. Now, I don't think I did exactly what he was doing. He's sort of in a league all on his own, but that was really the moment where I thought, I went to bed that night and I couldn't sleep. And, I think a lot of writers have had this moment where you're just like, it's in my head, and if I don't get it out, I'm not going to be able to go to sleep, or I'm not going to be able to move on. So got up and I wrote down my first story. And then I think at the time I was living alone, and there was a part of me that, because I'd lived through a pretty somewhat unique experience, I just thought, I kind of want to witness to what's going on. That was sort of the feeling that I had. I just want to witness to all the stuff that happened. And, through the process of writing the book, I, got the witness part, but I also was able to create a narrative because, as having read the book, it's so many confusing things happened externally, and so many confusing things were happening to me internally, and trying to sort of pull apart the difference between those things and trying to figure out who I was versus what I was affected by because of all of this crazy external stuff. Creating the narrative from sort of a beginning to, the end, just really helped me make sense of it.
I think that's something that fascinates me about your process here is, really it's quite like writing a story where you are the protagonist and you talk about going from beginning to end, but it very much is a lifelong process the way I saw it. And I'm curious about what it was like writing those earlier forms of yourself when you did not know as much as you now know, and whether or not that was a process of going back and embodying that younger self, that childhood self, or a reckoning between the two, between your former self and yourself knowing what you know now.
Well, it's interesting because I worked with an editor. I hired an editor before the book was purchased. Um, and I remember, I would get the note like, you don't know this now. You don't know this yet. So I got some guidance, which was really helpful. Um, but those early stories were so palpable in my head. All I really had to do was kind of strip away the parts that I'm one of those processing people. I'm processing everything. I'm thinking about everything. I'm trying to it's just the way my brain works. And um, being able to separate how I was actually feeling at that moment when I was 4 years old, or when I was 8 years old, or when I was 12. It was just kind of a stripping away. Initially I put too much in there, and too much reflection and too much understanding. And the editing process really helped me take care of that. And the editors that I worked with were, just so good at what they did that, they got me into the mind space to be able to, do that well. Or at least I hope do it well.
Absolutely. There was a line in the book that really stuck with me in particular, of many, but I wanted to use it as a jumping off point for a question. It's history, it turns out, is easier to transcend when you are building towards something new, as opposed to living for what's already lost. And I
Yeah.
think for anyone who's coming from a difficult background, that is such a key moment. And, whether it happens in therapy, whether it's with a group. And I would just love to hear more. Was there a moment for you in particular, when you found that out? Was it in writing this? Was it beforehand? Or what was your turning point? Or has that been a struggle at all?
Yeah, for me, that was about, a lot of the book is, it's described as a riches to rags story. That's sort of and it seems to me that, and I've known a lot of people, and certainly it was the case with a lot of our family members, that this being at that kind of level, at that sort of ridiculously privileged thing was, the only thing I can compare it to is like feeling like a celebrity, like you're just in this sort of bubble and you're elevated in some weird way that society you elevate yourself, society elevates you. And, when that gets taken away, I mean, I was 6 years old when, that started to crumble. So I didn't, live my whole life and then, feel like I was losing something. But, my parents did. And it was almost like they got frozen in that moment. And as soon as that freezing happened, which, I think is sort of the case of, for any human being, once you sort of freeze and stop growing and stop, adjusting and adapting to what's actually happening, you start to die. I mean, figuratively, and in, the case of my parents, a little bit literally. So that's really, it was an insight that I think I got pretty early on, because I could just see, people holding on to what they used to have, which was very heady, very exciting, very just this, super adrenaline rush all the time, and how dangerous that was, how that really was sort of the thing that led to, them, self-destructing. So
That was something that was really fascinating about the book to me, was that, like you said, you left that world when you were 6 years old. There really is not that tangible sense of loss in the book about loss of that society, because there's not, you don't seem to cling to it or to value it in the same way that your parents did. And it made for a really fascinating perspective that you were able to be witness to people going through that, rather than those feelings or those observations being eclipsed by the loss of the thing itself. And I loved that. So, I know I've made the Brideshead Revisited comparison, and I love that. I can see your mom as a Lady Marshmain. But what other memoirs and books have inspired and informed your writing?
Oh, I loved Running with Scissors. Sort of David Sedaris and Augustin Burroughs are the two comparisons that I use a lot. And I think I'm different than both of them. David Sedaris has this just incredibly, he skips over things so daintily and with such biting humor that you're just taken by surprise all the time. And Augustin Burroughs to me is, more biting and more sort of, he'll take a chunk out of you as he's, using his humor. And so I think I would say those two. I certainly loved The Glass Castle, all of Mary Carr's books. Oh, The Glory of It All, I loved. So yeah, they were all, as soon as I sort of felt something familiar in writing it, that's sort of the inspiration that I got. Okay, well, I've got the content, and the content is there, which is usually the biggest hurdle when writing a memoir. I was like, I've got so much content and so much juicy stuff. And, I thought, okay, well, I've written a few little stories and, people have responded to them. And, as you probably know, when you show stuff to your friends and they tell you how great it is, you never actually know. You hope you know, but you never actually really know, which is, that's what great friends are for. They're going to tell you that it's wonderful no matter what. So that's a little bit of a journey trying to go, okay, well, is it really good? Or is it just kind of, good for you good? And so when I put things on publicly, and people who I didn't know started reading them and commenting on them, and they're like, oh my God. And they're like, they would finish a thing. They'd be like, what happens next? You have to tell me what happens next. So yeah, I probably David Sedaris and Augustin Burroughs are sort of the two that felt, when I read them, I felt, okay, there's something familiar enough here, and people obviously are responding to it externally, that I thought, okay, I might be able to do something with my story.
Yeah, I'm so curious about these stories that you put out before the book came out. Did any of them make it in the book?
A bunch of them. This is how naive I was writing a memoir, I thought, because I had done so what I did is every day before work, I started writing at 8:00. And I gave myself 2 hours to write a full stories that my brothers and I had told, I'd been telling my friends forever. And I needed to do it in a way that it was good enough that I could then post it to this, what was Open Salon at the time, where, everybody could read it and comment on it. And I thought, okay, I have to do a full narrative story within that 2 hours. So,
Wow.
yeah. And, and they weren't very long. They were like blog posts, really. But they were a full narrative arc from the beginning to end, and mostly comic. They were all these funny little things that had cracked us up forever. And so I had about, I'd say 15 to 20 of them. And at the beginning I thought, okay, to make a memoir, what you do is you take the one that happened first and the one that happened second, put them all together in a little row, add a little, joiner, a little paragraph to put them together, and there you go, memoir done. And it turns out when I did that, I had like 30 pages, 40 pages.
Oh, no.
Some of the stories worked, some of them didn't. And so, yeah, I used a lot of it was just sort of curating the ones that really fit the larger narrative, because that's what I became really interested in. It wasn't just in these finite little stories that were just sort of funny and tongue in cheek. I then became really interested in telling a deeper story. Like I wanted to, when your mother's a severe alcoholic, and, there are all these sort of these, serious things that are happening, but, she's also just this incredible character who's, very funny at the same time. It becomes sort of tone deaf to kind of, just make fun of whatever this is, or make light of it. And that wasn't my real experience. My real experience was that a lot of this was very painful, and a lot of this was very difficult and disorienting. And I went through a lot of, personal turmoil throughout it. And so, yes, right, those stories were sort of the part of the structure, but then I realized that I wanted to tell a much deeper story about survival and navigating through, very confusing circumstances to discover who I am within the context of, these external things that are confusing me, and confusing, the story of myself. And, that deep sort of analysis of being able to pull it out and, really get to the heart of what actually happened, how I felt about it, what it meant in the larger trajectory of my life. That was the process that I went through, which was very cathartic. And I wanted to tell a good story. There's nothing worse than a memoir that's sort of a catharsis and, somebody working through their shit just to work through it. That tends not to work very well. So I had to be aware of that as well.
And that's what I think was so fantastic about this book for me. And also, you had that amazing New York Times book review today. Congratulations on that again.
Thank you.
And the reviewer called it a tragicomedy. And I thought in many ways it described it well. And the moments of humor, the experience of reading this book is one that felt very compulsive and addictive, because it is very funny. It was very insightful. It was very grab your attention and hold it, while still having the constant psychological undercurrents, which really for me made it a completely fluid experience between these funny episodes as well as the deeper meanings going on throughout the characters' lives. And none of the humor ever felt, at an inappropriate time. And you understood why people laugh through hardship when it's, happening simultaneously. And it all feels like such an honest, real reflection of the way that we go through our lives. And
yes,
I loved about it.
Thank you.
So I wanted to talk about the LGBT aspect. I loved that this was a story about, as an LGBT person as well, who didn't come out until my late 20s. I think it's really great to have memoirs and stories out here about when it takes longer than just into the teenage years to find yourself and discover that. And I think we're finally kind of moving to a time when we are sharing a wider range of stories. And I was curious what you see as, going forward in the LGBT community, how this plays a role and what is important for all of us going forward.
Yeah, I think certainly when I was growing up, and, my friends and I talk about this, I grew up in the age of George Michael and Wham and Culture Club. I remember talking to my friends like, oh, he just loves to dress up and, he's just flamboyant. And there was no sort of awareness that anybody was gay. Like that wasn't there was Elton John a little bit in the 80s. He sort of dabbled in saying he was bisexual, but in terms of what we saw, it was, Liberace, and he never even came out as gay. There were just, these sort of flamboyant, big personalities. And I just remember the feeling I can't be gay because I don't, I'm not there. I don't see anybody. And, a lot of the pop culture back then, if there was a gay character, it was a very tragic, sad figure, or sort of the little buddy who was just there for comic relief, but nobody took seriously. And I didn't want to be either of those things. So I just thought there's no space for me here. I think that, I joined the Human Rights Campaign board and, was there during the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell and, the marriage equality decision and all that stuff. And all that change happened so quickly. And it's one of the things that the reviewer in the New York Times talks about is, what are their stories going to be? And, just that freedom, the freedom to be able to see such a wide range of examples of what the LGBTQ community is, I hope will mean that, the stories will just sort of be them, expressing their, the full range of their humanity and not having had to go through this sort of peeling away of all of these layers before you can even know who you are to then decide how you feel about who you are. So that's what I'm hoping. It seems like that there's a pretty good chance that will happen as it becomes just more of a thing that's so integrated into our society as opposed to this separate part.
Absolutely. I totally see it the same way in that, looking back and not being able to, when anyone who is LGBT was a character or a caricature in that way, and not being able to see an example of, this is who I can live my life modeled after. These are the people I'm surrounded with, and things have changed so quickly. And, I think it'll just keep propelling forward.
Well, and it's important, to mention that, you're in Mississippi, there are a lot of places still that, there are kids out there who feel completely alone and isolated and aren't living in sort of larger, more urban places where, it's just kind of accepted. So, that's still a reality too. So there's still a long way to go.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think you and I are from similar backgrounds in that I didn't meet an LGBT person for the first time until I left my small rural town for college. And I think it's a question of, more and more all of us getting to meet people when we're younger and wherever we're living, and being able to be more exposed to those communities. And I'm sure, Mississippi, there aren't too many people openly gay out and about, and we can continue just educating people. And it's hard to hate someone that you already know and love. So I'm hoping that'll help.
So true. That's the coming out is the most important part to really help move things along.
Absolutely. So what was your process? We talk about building that narrative, and we talked a bit before we launched this call about the idea of when you're working with a story, you built this into a really compelling story that, functions like a novel, functions like the kind of full story arc that draws people in and takes them on that journey. What was it like for you to take so many different moving parts that are factual and can't be, pushed around as much as we do when we write a novel, and organizing those into a narrative? Did you have multiple narratives that you worked with? Did you know where you wanted to begin and end from the beginning? How did that go?
Well, I knew where it began. It was going to begin at the beginning of my beginning. And I knew it would end with the death of my mother, because she was the most pivotal influence on my life. And so, in the early drafts of what I had written, I remember somebody saying to me, we see all these people and you're writing them so well, and, they're hilarious, and, they're infuriating, and they're all these things, but where are you? And I was like, well, I'm not the interesting character here. And they're like, well, you're the one that they're going to understand the story through, so you need to put yourself in here more. And so I think, it's like anything. If people really sit down and go through the process of, when they're born to where they are at the end of the story, there is a narrative there. There is a reason that you sort of move from one thing to the other. There are moments that you're stuck, and there are breakthrough moments, and there are things that move you on to the next thing. And I do this whole thing about going to Al-Anon and really sort of understanding alcoholism in a way that was just sort of this light bulb going off, like, oh my God, now I get it. And then I went back to school, and still, that was one part that I got, but there was still a whole other part of me that I wasn't getting. And I thought, okay, I'm done. And then, there's the other little thing that you then need to start uncovering and making sense of. So it really is just that digging deep to, create your own story, because everybody has it, and it's hard. I mean, it was really, there are parts of it that, I'd send and I'd be like, oh my God, this is boring. Can we take this out? I just don't, because again, a lot of the stories are these adrenaline rush of these really extreme things happening. And then, as I'm talking about myself after college, I'm like, okay, well, can we speed this up a little bit? And they're like, the editor's like, no, we need to see how you're evolving and changing, because that's going to be the connector that gets people to really, understand your larger point and go on the journey with you, so that there can be a satisfying ending to it. but yeah, I had the same, I had the same reaction as I imagined a reader would, like, okay, well, I've got this part. How do I make this relevant enough to be compelling enough to move us to the next thing, to get us to this final satisfying conclusion? And I hope that's what happened.
Absolutely. Did your experience of, the way that you saw your past and all of those relationships, did it change when you were able to complete this and see your life as a book? Because that's an experience I think very few people get to have.
I think so. Yeah. I fought hard for my mental health, and this book was a big component of that. Because when I got stuck in the narrative, I had to figure out what exactly was it that happened, and how did I feel about it, and why was I stuck, and what was the part of me that I'm not revealing, that I'm not exploring, because I was so ambitious about getting this down on paper. And I'm such a harsh critic when it comes to reading books that I was like, I have to want to read this book. I have to want to be somebody who, is going to be moved from the beginning to the end and not get stuck. So yeah, I mean, for me, it was just that ambition of, I've got this. And, I know a lot of writers have this feeling like, I know exactly how I want it to be. And it's the question of, how do I get it from here through my fingers in a way that really nails it? And, when I wasn't nailing it, I just kept going back, and I rewrote this book like a gazillion times. And, each time just dug a little bit deeper and pulled a little bit more. And, I left it all on the field for, is that a metaphor? It's a metaphor.
Left it all on the page.
A sports metaphor. Good for me. So yeah, that it really is just sort of a breaking yourself wide open and then finding not just because nobody's interested in anybody's sort of process of catharsis while they're reading a book. They want to know they want a good story.
So I love the title, Filthy Beasts. And of course that's what your mother called you and your brothers. Was that with you from the very beginning as what you wanted to call this, or when did that title come about?
Yes. Yep. I love the phrase. I love the word filthy. I love the word beasts. I love the two words together. And I really like, that it's a term of endearment that my mother used. And, my mother said a lot of things in a very sing-song, sweet voice, and the actual content of it was, could be construed as kind of brutal. So I love the fact that the characters in the book, I mean, real people, including myself, are complicated, flawed, sometimes awful, and I just loved the humanity of it all, the down and dirty, the, poignant, the funny, all of those things. And I just thought, because it's a book about these very flawed people doing some pretty horrendous things, and, I get to be the hero of the story because I'm writing it, and, how I navigate through a lot of it as I'm doing some, horrendous things myself. I liked the fact that it came to me as a term of endearment, something that's sort of sweet and innocent, but there's a whole other definition of what a filthy beast is. And, there's plenty of those moments in this book, with everybody, there are no heroes, there are no villains. They're just I didn't want to write a hero story. I didn't want to write a villain story. I didn't want to sort of these one-dimensional people. I find them kind of boring. So, I wanted just a big pile of filthy beasts everywhere, just doing their best to get through and not doing very well in a lot of circumstances. So.
Realize you and I are very similar in our titles there, Filthy Beasts and Rough Animals.
Yes.
Describing equally gray area people.
Totally.
So I loved this note that you wrote in your acknowledgments to your brothers when you were thanking them for help in telling you all's story and your truth. And I was curious of your experience, what it's like to write about people you know. And, you know, as a fiction writer, I'm very self-conscious of even, you know, showing a glimmer of people I know. And what was it like for you, you know, writing real life people?
Yeah. So, and that's a very important point. And, you know, I wanted that stated overtly that I wrote our story. A lot of our, you know, we've talked about all these things that have happened and we're remarkably in agreement, which is not always the case about what actually happened. But it is my story. It is my perspective. You know, there have been, there have been conversations with people who are in the book, and you know, this sort of wistful kind of feeling like, you know, I wish they knew more about that person because, you know, it would give more context to their part of it. And, you know, I'm so aware of that and I'm so sensitive to it. But, you know, at the end of the day, it was my story from beginning to end. And each of the people in there, you know, either feed that or it's either relevant to that or not. And so nobody gets a full story. Both of my brothers have stories of their own. I mean, Monty, my younger brother, I would probably be a pretty dark character in his version of this story, at least certainly at the beginning. You know, hopefully I redeemed myself as I got older, but I wasn't a very good older brother. I mean, I was so mired in my own shit that, you know, it's hard to be there for anybody, you know, and I've beaten myself up a lot about it because, you know, you tell the story that you're going to be like a really good, you know, brother and a really good advocate, and I wasn't. And, you know, similar with my older brother, he can tell a whole other version of the, who he was in my particular story. So luckily I'm just blessed with, you know, our family is pretty hard boiled in terms of it takes a lot to, you know, our ethos growing up was that, you know, hurt feelings just weren't part of the deal. You gave it back, you served it back. You didn't sort of cower in a corner because nobody had any time for that. So I was just sort of blessed with people who had been through the ringer, you know, in terms of just how we related to each other. And there's a ton of affection in that.
There is this part in the book that always, it just really drew me in. I reread it a number of times when you and your brothers are later recalling an incident that happened with Jamie, the babysitter. And many years later, you recall the incident with clarity, and Robin didn't remember it, and Monty, it came flooding back as a realization. And it just struck me how it's so true that, you know, we all out of our lives, certain moments really stick with us, certain moments don't, that between every relationship, whether it's growing up as siblings, parent to child, or even friendships, that our stories are compiled of this series of events that we remember mixed in with a bunch that we don't. And
Yes.
so it's fascinating, just the almost infinite number of impressions and stories and the way that we see each other and others see us that can result out of that.
Yeah, so that was a really interesting one. And of course, it makes sense. You know, when you're 7 years old, which is when this story happened to me, to all of us, you know, I was the one witnessing part of it, and my older brother was not there. So, but when you're 7 and this thing happens to you and it's traumatic and it's, you know, you almost have this thing where you think, okay, well, everybody must know it. Everybody experienced what I experienced. There's that sort of self-involved thing of, you know, being young and thinking, you know, my experience is everybody's. And of course, Monty, you know, being sort of the primary victim of that situation. And he was 4 years old. And, you know, I can imagine just wanting to block it out and, you know, having a sense, because it was definitely something that was alluded to when we were growing up, but just never overtly discussed. That, and it was such an individual experience for each of us that, you know, it was only in the moment where, he came back much later and said that he wanted to meet us, that, my instant thing was, hell no, I never want to see you again. And the other two were like, okay. And I was so confused. And it was only after that we started talking about it. And my older brother was like, I don't remember that part. And Monty was like, I knew something happened, but I didn't really know what it was. And I'm like, well, let me tell you, because it was horrendous. And so I, in that particular story, was the witness. I was the one. And I'm sure there are other examples where, Monty was, or Robin was, and I was the one who was sort of clueless to something. But in that particular thing, I was the one who, was the memory.
This is making me think very much of fiction in the way that we often have in novels, the witness and the protagonist are two different people. And sometimes the witness is the one who introduces you to the story, and then you go off running. And it fascinates me, just the idea of writing as both protagonist and witness, your acknowledgement of being part of this tribe, of part of this group, and watching as well as belonging at the same time.
Yeah.
So can you tell us at all about what you're working on now?
I'm working on a novel because I was so jealous of novelists while I was going through this thing. And I'm like, oh, there's sort of a blank spot here. How do I fill this gap? And, as we talked about a little earlier before this, having the luxury of just, oh, well, I can make somebody do something there. So anyway, it's a novel. But I also discovered that the things that are most compelling to me, and when I do my best writing, is when it's based in something real and something usually that I'm really struggling with, and a conflict that I can't make sense of. So this novel is fiction, but it is certainly based in a real situation, and where my group of friends, who were sort of my chosen family, which happens, to a lot of people who have very difficult primary families. They became my chosen family, and there was a couple at the center of that group who split up in a explosive way. And there was a divide within the friend group as to what actually happened, the interpretation of what happened, and the real struggle of, okay, what do each of us value? What do we think is important? And again, I'm not interested in people who are right and people who are wrong and people who are better and people who are more righteous. And I'm interested in why some people viewed it this way and why other people viewed it that way. So that's as close as I have gotten, and sort of, as we talked earlier, just sort of figuring out how to put it together in a way that, moves from beginning to end and is compelling and real. And, that's kind of the crux of it. I'm really interested in that, that divide that happened with people that I thought I knew so well and that were so, that I thought would just see everything the way that I did, and it didn't happen that way, and it caused a lot of strain and a lot of difficulty. And I'm interested in the exploration of that, and of course, creating a compelling enough narrative within that sort of, that makes sense, and that again moves it from beginning to the end in a satisfying way. So that's where I am right now, still in the creation phase.
I love the way you describe writing as being quite like therapy, that it is those really difficult things that we want to work out and when we're writing. And what is it about writing to you that you think allows you to tackle those difficult topics that you were struggling with before?
Yeah, all I can tell you is that before I sit down to write, I think I've got nothing to say. I don't know what I'm going to do. And if I do it, it's going to be like a Dick and Jane book. It's like, and what happens to me is that I sit down and write, and then things start coming. And I'm like, oh, it's almost like this conduit through which a little subconscious part of me gets activated. And I can then, paint a picture, paint a scene, paint something that I had no concept of before I started to sit down to write it. So I think that's why I do it. You know, I'm not a journaler. I don't sit down and journal my feelings. And when I did, it was really, really boring and really, really bad. I wanted to, I think it's in the creation of the story and something that I would be really riveted to, you know, go on that journey. That is the impulse for me to want to do it. So yeah, it's the means by which I understand my world and I understand the people within it. You know, human nature is so fascinating to me, why people do the things that they do. um, I'm endlessly fascinated by it. And, you know, I want the characters that I'm bringing to life on the screen to, you know, have all the elements of a really interesting person. And I can't conceive it until I put my fingers on the keyboard and things start happening.
I love that description of it. It's very much the same way that, you know, writing works for me as well. It's just, it doesn't start really happening until you start involving yourself in the story. But would you like to read any of it for us? We'd love to
Sure.
hear a passage.
Yeah, I'll start from the beginning. I won't read the prologue, but I'll start with chapter 1. And again, I don't have to set the context because this is pretty much the beginning of the book. I remember them laughing. I was a 4-year-old boy dressed in a pink halter top and miniskirt with pearls and heels, a cardboard gay liberation sign hanging around my neck. I wasn't sure what to make of the laughter. I was making people happy, but it seemed like their sharp cackles betrayed something other than joy. It was the first time I had been the subject of adult laughter, and there was something sinister about it. The laughter spiked when I wiggled my hips as instructed, making it difficult to stay balanced on my mother's 2-inch heels. My 7-year-old brother, Robin, wearing a dark suit, his hair combed down like a Wall Street banker's, walked beside me. My mother laughed the loudest. It was the annual Labor Day skit at our Adirondack Hunting and Fishing Club. More than 100 people lined both sides of the enormous main room of the clubhouse to watch individual family camps perform cute skits using props like deer antlers and fishing rods. Puns like, "There's something fishy going on," or "That was unbearable," accompanied light-hearted stories acted out by loving parents who swam after their kids in fake trout fins or chased them draped in grizzly pelts. Earlier at our family's camp, my mother had kneeled down to dress me, giggling like a naughty schoolgirl. My father rifled through his closet, trying to find a necktie that would fit my older brother. "But I don't want to," I kept saying. "Oh, hush," my mother said. "It will be fun." I was bouncing up and down and twisting my body back and forth. "Hold still, Kirkland," she said, her giggles elevating. "You're going to lose your, oh my God, you're going to lose your top. Bobby, you've got to come in here." "There's my pretty little boy," my father said as he walked into the bathroom. "I'm not pretty," I yelled. "You look like a hooker," my father told me proudly. "His boob's sticking out," my mother cried. "It's not funny," I said, stamping my foot, yet at the same time cracking a tentative smile. I didn't know what gay liberation meant, but on some level I knew that I had been chosen over Robin to be the girl. It felt like a warning and a little bit of a punishment, and I sensed the injustice of being made a prop for my mother's amusement, but I delighted in how happy it made her. My mother was beautiful. Most people are understandably dubious of this claim, probably assuming that as a son, I see her how I want to see her. But she was beautiful, indisputably. People compared her to Grace Kelly and Candice Bergen, but it was the comparisons to Jackie Kennedy Onassis that she liked the best. Even as her son, I was as in awe of her as the rest of the world seemed to be. I appreciated how the expression of her beauty changed with her moods, how her bright green eyes sparkled innocently when she was telling a funny story, or held somebody's gaze as she listened to them. She had fair skin and naturally blonde, shoulder-length hair that fell in wisps in front of her eyes, or from behind her ears in endless variations. Her smile was lit from a source deep inside of her, candid and genuine, so it was easy for me to tell when she was faking one. Her high cheekbones didn't lift, The smile looked more like a scowl, but it was the eyes that gave her away. I always knew how my mother felt by looking into her eyes. My father was not lit from the inside. He would have been considered cosmetically good-looking, with dark curly hair and dimpled cheeks. He had the kind of aristocratic frame that was both athletic and sexless, like many men of his ilk. A blank canvas onto which was painted Nantucket red pants, Gucci loafers, and nondescript button-down short-sleeve shirts. His side of the family was pure white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, Mayflower descendant, white butler rich. The butler's name was Eugene, and in my memory, he wore a tuxedo all day long, but it might have just been a suit. We had many portraits of bygone relatives hanging throughout our house. One of my great-grandfather looking like Teddy Roosevelt, reading studiously with pince-nez hanging off his nose, and a second great-grandfather in a suit, standing upright with a cane, both men humorless and commanding. Perhaps the painting of my grandfather, showing him looking relaxed behind the helm of one of his 3 yachts, is telling of the family fortune that would be lost under his watch. My parents and one of his many girlfriends were usually the only guests included on my grandfather's yachting trips up the Maine coast every summer. He left my grandmother at home. We lived in Cedarhurst, a quiet Long Island suburb, on a dead-end street lined with enormous maple and oak trees that created a protective canopy over the neighborhood. 3 homes made up our family compound. The 3-story, 4,000 square foot house we lived in had been a wedding present from my father's parents. On one side of us was my great Aunt Peg's house, a 13,000 square foot mansion called Lauderdale that my great grandfather Henry Hobart Porter had built in the late 1800s. On the other side lived Peg's son Seton, named after another ancestor, Mother Seton, and his family. I asked my aunt once if my grandmother's middle name, Delano, indicated any relation to FDR. She scowled and said, "Grandfather never liked to talk about that cousin. He was a Democrat."
Well, thank you so much for sharing that with us. Absolutely loved it. We will take some questions from the audience now. If y'all want to post your questions in the chat or in the Q&A options on your screen, we will answer them here. So from Karen, question: I'm wondering how Kirkland thinks his parents, as their younger/healthier selves, would react to reading his memoir. Also, how have his brothers, nieces, and nephews and extended family reacted to the book?
My parents, as their younger selves, would be appalled. You know, I grew up in a waspy world where people didn't talk about this stuff. I mean, I still, you know, a lot of my extended family and friends are still in the sort of, you know, that feeling of just not talking about these types of things. So, I mean, I think they would be appalled to see what happened. And, you know, so generally they would probably think, you know, we don't talk about those sorts of things, is my guess. And the other part was my nieces and nephews and people like that, what they think. Yeah, it's been, you know, I've kept an open, I was like, you know, anything you want to talk about, anything that bothers you, anything that's difficult, you know, I'm here to talk about it. And they've been amazingly supportive and, you know, excited. And so, yeah, I've just been very lucky in that respect.
Our next question is from Anonymous. Kirkland, when was the moment in your life that you realized your family and family experience was different than most?
Oh, that's a good one. It's very hard to figure out. It's only when I started to go, when I went away to school, probably, you know, I went to boarding school and there were still at the place that I went to, a lot of people that were similar. I think it's probably when I went to Tulane. And, you know, I talk about in the book, you know, I lived on a hall and, you know, parents would send care packages and they would check in with their children. And, you know, I'd tell this story about how my mother called, I think my freshman year, and she was asking about a class that I took when I was in boarding school. And she hadn't really processed that I was now in college, that she was she was still asking me questions about, you know, what had happened to me the year before, because she just hadn't, you know, kept up with what was happening, including the fact that I'd moved from, you know, Massachusetts to Louisiana and was starting college. So, yeah, that I can tell you about that.
The next question up is, did you share your family stories for verification with other family members, or did you keep your perception of it to yourself for the book?
I did. As I said, we've talked about it a lot when we were growing up. I mean, most of the stories that involve certainly my brothers were stories that we've been sharing for a long time. You know, maybe not all the details. There was something that, you know, after my younger brother read the book, he's like, you know, you presented it in this way, but that's, and I was referencing something that he was doing, and he's like, you know, that wasn't the primary reason for that. And I said, okay, then let's change it. Let's, you know, tell me more about, you know, what actually happened from your perspective. And so, yeah, I was very open to that. But for the most part, it was remarkably, we were remarkably on the same page with most of those things. And I'm just talking about my brothers. I haven't spoken with everyone. I actually spoke with Ethan, who's my friend from college, and we just had this amazing conversation. He's just like, you know, I'm so distressed at the things that I said that had such an impact on you. And, you know, I know who I was at that time. I probably said those things. I don't remember saying them, but it's absolutely within my realm of belief that I did because of who I was then. And I'm just, I'm different than that now. And so there were things like that where, you know, some people didn't remember, and which makes perfect sense to me. You know, memory is so tricky, and, you know, it could even be the case that the way I remembered something is not exactly the way it happened, as memory goes, but it's a memoir and not a historical record. So it's one of the you know, the leeway that you get when you write a book like this. But it's all true as far as my understanding and my memory of things. It is my truth, not the truth. Yeah.
Oh, I was just going to say, I love the update about Ethan. That relationship was one of my favorite parts of the book. So
yeah, we got right back into it. And I remembered why I was so drawn to him after talking to him after so many years.
That's wonderful. So next question is from Heather. Did you follow the classic experience of seeking out partners in early relationships to create the dysfunction that you grew up with? If so, at what age did the clarity come from that? It's a great question.
Yeah, well, here's the thing. When you're gay and you don't know it, all of my early relationships were these crushes on these beautiful, amazing women who were just unavailable. And that was my expression. So I guess I was fortunate in the sense that I wasn't ever going to fake a relationship. There was still, even though I didn't know who I was and I didn't know that I was gay, I just thought, okay, well, this hasn't happened for me yet. And I never forced it. I never made it happen just because I thought it should happen. So that was lucky for me. And that was probably lucky for a lot of women who I might have, it might've been very hurtful. Yeah, certainly in the, early days of dating as a gay man, I was attracted to people who weren't very nice to me. And, that felt so familiar and exciting and just sort of like, oh, this is, that's what's so weird about attraction. You're attracted to, what you know. And I worked really hard to sort of break that cycle down because I had the two narratives going on in my head. There was what I was feeling and what I was drawn to, and then what I was left at, that sort of residue of feeling sort of bad about myself and letting people treat me in certain ways that didn't feel good. And, I really had to kind of bust through that and just decide that I was going to use my head at the beginning a lot more than, my heart or other parts of my body. And that has served me well because I'm married to a wonderful man who treats me incredibly well, and I'm very lucky to have him.
So the next one is from Anne. I am sitting here wrapped by the two of you beautiful, brilliant people. You mentioned that readers are not interested in your process of catharsis. I actually am. Are you still processing and healing as you see your story / your life reflected in people's reactions to Filthy Beasts?
Well, I remember sort of in the early days when, I first started posting these stories on these public blog sites. I was pretty sure at the reaction that I would get. People would think it was funny and, just a laugh riot. Half of them were like, oh my God, that's so, I was rolling on the floor laughing. And the other half were, oh my God, are you okay? This sounded really traumatic. And I was really surprised by those because I hadn't yet, I'd been so invested in this idea of the story that I was telling that it was in the reactions that I was getting that I was like, okay, this isn't just all funny. And that was sort of the catalyst for me to, really sort of start to go deeper. But in terms of now, I don't know. I mean, it's at the very beginning. So I may be, sort of surprised and there may be something that comes at me that's going to be really helpful for me to think of something in a way that I haven't. But, most of the people who have read it are just the people very close to me who are my friends, and we've talked about it, and I have no idea how it's going to play in the larger world. And I'm fascinated to see that. I love your kitty cat, by the way.
Oh.
There's a little kitty cat tail that sort of.
Can you see him? There is. I'm fostering.
No, I love it. It's sort of this weird little thing that happens every now and then that, it's great.
Our next question is from Dwight. Kirk, was it difficult to find the humor within such painful experiences?
No, it was more difficult to find what was really underneath the humor. The humor was the easy part. That certainly wasn't the case in everything. And there were a lot of parts that just weren't, there's no way to make them funny. But initially the funny was the easier part because it was our family coping mechanism. It was our family ethos. There was nothing off bounds. There was nothing that could be so, extreme that it couldn't be funny. And that's what I grew up in and around. And I really have, I'm really grateful for that now that I've added another component, because if you just live your whole life deciding that, you can laugh through, things that are really authentically difficult and painful, then at some point the laughter is going to go away and you're not going to be able to find it again.
Well said. This is from Alex. How did the Bermuda years change you or the family dynamic?
Well, that's when my parents got divorced. I talk about how at the very beginning when we moved to Bermuda, my mother just sort of blossomed in this sort of way. She was freer than I had ever seen her before, and she became this powerhouse personality. She was married to my father. She met my father at 19. They were married when she was 20. Had her first child when she was 21. I mean, that seems so crazy now, but that was somewhat of the norm back then. And she was this, I don't know, there's so much of her that I didn't really get to know, but all the evidence suggests that she was just this powerhouse person who had so much potential and was kind of living in this very limited experience, very privileged, and nobody's going to be crying for the situation that she was in that regard, but it was a very limiting experience for her, I believed. And so when, we moved to Bermuda and she was able to blossom and just kind of become this new, sort of ballsy, take charge person that I was really drawn to and just admired so much. You know, there was that shadow thing of, you know, the loss of the privilege and the loss of the ease and the loss of the, you know, people thinking that you're amazing just because of, you know, the wealth that you have or the places that you go or, you know, the things you're able to do that other people aren't able to do. And that was the thing that just sort of stuck, and she never could she never could move past it, and it started to eat away and eat away. And yeah, so yeah, those early Bermuda years were her blossoming. And then, you know, as I said earlier, she got stuck in that feeling of something that was lost that she would never get back, that was so pivotal to her sense of herself. And that's when, you know, things started to go downhill.
Our next question is from Bronwyn. It's, as the mother of a 13-year-old, my observation is that Gen Z seems to be so blind to, among other things, sexual orientation. Are you as hopeful as I am that their generation will be able to move the LGBT community forward?
I mean, it's moving forward in ways that I could never imagine, and I have to adjust to. I mean, that's the other thing that's so interesting. I mean, when I first joined HRC, you know, the transgender experience was fairly new, and we were learning about it, and we were trying to understand, like, okay, you know, I was very confused at the beginning, the difference between sexual orientation and gender identity. You know, it took some understanding and learning, and I'm part of the community. So now, you know, non-binary and poly and all these terms, they're changing so quickly and so fast, and just this incredible freedom for that kids feel now to just sort of express who they are without these limitations. Yeah, I'm incredibly optimistic. I you know, on one hand, I understand why it's frustrating for people. You're like, oh my God, are you going to add another letter now? And I have to figure out what that letter means. I certainly get that. And then there's another part of me that just goes, you know what? That's, you know, this is progress, and this is moving forward, and this is people becoming freer and who they are. And why isn't that just a good thing, even if you have to do a little work to understand it? I mean, we're all here to do a little work to understand things. And as I've alluded to before, there are the people who do the work and adapt and change and progress, and there are those who don't. And my analysis of the situation is that the people who are adapting and changing and understanding and trying to understand are happier than the ones who decide they're sticking their foot down and they don't want to hear another letter at the end of the whole chain, because they're done, they're over it. You can be over it, but it's not going to change what's real, what's actually happening.
Any other questions? Just give them a minute. Well, thank you all so much for joining us, and thank you, Kirkland. I absolutely loved the book and so glad to have been able to read it, and I hope you all get to read it as well. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed this. My first one ever, and you were amazing. I really appreciate it. And thank you, everybody, for tuning in and for your questions. I really, really appreciate it, and I hope you love the book.
Thank you so much, Kirkland. It was very excellent for a very first Zoom event for a book launch. Thank you, congratulations, and thank you to Ray. Thank you to everyone who asked questions. If you missed any of the event, we'll have it on YouTube soon. Please buy the book if you haven't already. We have the link on the event page and the chat. It helps us put on more free events, and it is discounted for a limited time only. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.